Horrific systems in history. We usually explain them in a very simple way. We say, those people were evil, or at least, enough people were evil for it to work. And that explanation feels good. Because if the problem was evil people, then the solution is quite easy. Just don't be one of them. But that explanation falls apart the moment you look a little bit closer. Because most people living in those systems weren't monsters, they weren't unusually cruel. They weren't waking up every day thinking about how to hurt others. They were ordinary people trying to survive, adapt, and live normal lives in situations that were anything but normal. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because once you accept that, the question changes. It's no longer, how could evil people do this? It becomes, why do ordinary people come to accept systems that are clearly harmful? And once you ask that, another question follows almost immediately. Are those people victims of circumstances? Are they passive bystanders? Or are they complicit and therefore morally responsible? Because it's very easy to judge. It's very easy to say what should have been done when you're not living in fear, uncertainty, and pressure every day. So, this isn't about excusing anyone, and it's not about declaring everyone guilty either. It's about understanding how responsibility becomes blurred, how moral boundaries slowly shift, and how people can find themselves part of something horrific without even feeling like they crossed a line. Not because they were evil, but because the situation made adaptation easier than the resistance. That's the question I want to sit with here. If the question is why ordinary people adapt to horrific systems, we need a case where that adaptation didn't happen on the margins and didn't happen in society we can easily dismiss as irrational or backward. That's why Nazi Germany works as a case study. This is one of the most documented societies in modern history. We don't just have records of leaders and major events, we have diaries, letters, newspapers, school materials, documents. We can actually trace how changes filter down into everyday life. That's rare. In many historical cases, violence erupts suddenly, or power changes hands through coups and civil wars. Those moments are important, but they make it harder to study adaptation. Germany, by contrast, allows us to observe something slower. We can see how the laws were introduced, how new norms appeared gradually, how people adjusted not all at once, but piece by piece. Another reason this case matters is that the transition happened largely within existing structures. The state didn't collapse and get rebuilt from scratch. Institutions didn't disappear overnight. Courts, ministries, schools, workplaces, they continued to function. Which means we can ask a very precise question. How much change can a society absorb while still feeling familiar to the people living inside of it? Because if daily life continues, if you still go to work, still shop for food, still send your kids to school, it becomes much harder to identify the moment when adaptation turns into something else. The regime didn't rely only on constant violence to maintain control, especially in the earlier years. Many people encountered it first through regulations and paperwork. It can begin with compliance, with routine, with the feeling that this is simply how things are done now. So we are not using this example because it's the most extreme outcome. We're using it because it allows us to study the mechanism, a society where changes were gradual enough, documented enough, and normalized enough that we can ask, in a grounded way, how ordinary people navigated it without necessarily experiencing themselves as villains. Germany, in the interwar period, wasn't some illiterate, isolated society that didn't know better. In the late 19th and early 20th century, literacy in Germany was already described as close to universal. People read, a lot. Weimar Germany set in the peak era of print culture. By the mid-1920s, Germany had over 4,000 daily or weekly newspapers, plus thousands of specialized periodicals. So the idea that this was a population living in some information vacuum just doesn't hold. Politics was also not silent or simplistic. It was loud, fragmented, and everywhere. During the Weimar years, around 40 parties were represented in the Reichstag across the Republic's short life. That tells you something important. Public discourse wasn't a single channel. It was messy, competitive, plural, sometimes to the point of instability. Higher education is another concrete marker. We have enrollment data showing tens of thousands of university students. So, there was a large educated class, professional training pipelines, and a real intellectual ecosystem. And institutionally, the state didn't vanish between governments. Weimar had a ridiculous number of cabinets, 20 cabinets in 14 years, and research on the period explicitly notes that bureaucracy becomes an anchor of stability and continuity. So, even when parliamentary politics were unstable, administrative structures kept everyday governments functioning. That's why this case hit so hard, because if you want conforming story, you can say, this happened because people were uneducated or irrational, but Weimar Germany doesn't let you do that. This was a society with near universal literacy, an enormous press ecosystem, intense political life, functioning higher education, and durable state administration. So, whatever we are trying to explain, the ordinary person adaptation, the shifting of norms, we can't explain it away as they didn't know better. We have to treat it as something that can happen inside modern, educated, institution heavy societies. If Germany was a modern, educated society used to law, institutions, and rational governments, the obvious question is what kind of pressure was it under? And that's where the end of the First World War comes into picture. Because Germany didn't experience defeat in a way that feels like a clear military collapse. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, German troops were still largely outside German territory. There were no Allied armies marching through Berlin, no images of capital city in ruins. For many civilians, daily life hasn't been marked by a visible invasion. So the war ended not with a dramatic, undeniable loss, but with a sudden surrender announced from above. That made the defeat harder to process. At the same time, the cost of the war had been enormous. Millions of soldiers were dead or wounded. The economy was exhausted. Food shortages had already caused unrest before the war even ended. And then, almost immediately, the political system collapsed. The monarchy fell, and the republic was proclaimed. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't negotiated in any meaningful sense from the German perspective. German representatives weren't invited to shape it, they were presented with the terms and told to sign. Those terms were experienced not just as harsh, but as humiliating. Germany was forced to accept legal responsibility for the war. Large parts of its territory were taken away, along with millions of people. The army was reduced to symbolic force, and whole regions were demilitarized. Reparations were imposed on a scale that felt abstract, enormous, and never-ending. And all of this happened in a society that understood law and national dignity very clearly. So the message many people received wasn't just you lost, it was you are to blame, and you no longer have control. This humiliation was an emotional slogan, and also a political experience. Because Versailles didn't just punish the state, it delegitimized the new democratic system that accepted it. The government that signed the treaty was quickly labeled as weak, dishonest, even treacherous. The idea spread that the country hadn't really been defeated on the battlefield, but has been betrayed from within. And once that narrative took hold, trust in democratic institutions eroded very quickly. So you have a modern, educated society, deeply familiar with law and order, suddenly experiencing defeat without invasion, political collapse without consensus, and peace settlement that feels imposed rather than agreed upon. That combination matters because it creates a situation where the existing framework, law, democracy, rational governments no longer feel protective. They feel like part of the problem. Alongside political defeat and humiliation, there was something even more immediate for most people: economic instability. And this wasn't abstract, it hit everyday life directly. After the war, Germany was heavily in debt. The state had financed the war largely through loans, expecting victory to cover the cost later. When that victory never came, the burden didn't disappear. It landed on a society that was already exhausted. In the early 1920s, this turned into something far more destructive: hyperinflation. Money lost its meaning. Savings that people had built over decades became worthless in a matter of months. Middle-class families watched their financial security evaporate almost overnight. Pensions, salaries, insurance, all of it collapsed. And that kind of experience just doesn't create poverty, it destroys the trust. Because if you did everything right, worked, saved, followed the rules, and still lost everything, then the system itself starts to feel unreliable. Unemployment followed, not as a temporary inconvenience, but as a mass phenomenon. For many people, the fear wasn't just being poor, it was failing, societally, professionally, permanently. The idea of stability, of a predictable future, started to feel like a luxury. And this matters for how democracy was perceived. The Weimar system was associated in people's daily experience with crises, management that never seemed to end. Coalition government collapsed, policies changed, emergency measures became normal. So, democracy wasn't experienced as empowerment, it was experienced as fragility. Then, for a brief moment, things seemed to improve. In the mid 1920s, the economy stabilized. Inflation was brought down under control. There was a sense, especially in urban areas, that life was becoming manageable again. And that's what makes the next shock even more crushing. Because the global financial crash at the end of the decade hit Germany particularly hard, the economy was deeply dependent on foreign loans, especially from the United States. When those loans dried up after the stock market crash, the effects were immediate. Businesses collapsed, unemployment skyrocketed again, this time on a massive scale. Millions of people were suddenly without work, without income, without any realistic expectations of recovery. And this wasn't just another crisis. For many, it felt like proof that the system had failed repeatedly, that stability was an illusion, that democratic institutions could not shield society from economic disaster. So by the end of 1920s, you had a population that had lived through defeat, humiliation, inflation, brief recovery, and then collapse all over again. Not chaos in the streets every day, but constant insecurity. And in that kind of environment, trust becomes a scarce resource. Trust in money, trust in institutions, trust in future. And all of this had political consequences. Because when instability isn't a temporary crisis, but a recurring state of life, people don't just lose money, they lose confidence that the system knows what it's doing, and that tomorrow will be better than today. In theory, democracy offered representation and debate. In practice, for many people, it started to look like paralysis. Governments came and went, coalitions collapsed, decisions felt slow and compromised and endlessly negotiated, while everyday life kept getting harder. So, democracy wasn't judged on principles, and it was more judged on the results. And the results didn't feel reassuring. That's where political polarization intensified. As the center struggled to govern, extremes started to look more clear, louder, and more decisive. Politics stopped feeling like a space for cooperation and started to feel like battlefield. The political debates became sharper, language became more aggressive. Opponents were no longer just wrong, they were dangerous. And for ordinary people trying to survive, this constant conflict added another layer of uncertainty. Nothing felt stable, predictable, or like it was under control. People want orientation. They want something solid to hold on to. Clear rules, clear explanations, a sense that suffering has meaning and direction. Order starts to feel comforting. Stability starts to feel more important than debate. And the promise of purpose, of being part of something larger, something coherent, becomes deeply attractive. This isn't about people suddenly loving authoritism. It's about exhaustion. Exhaustion with uncertainty, with instability, with systems that seem unable to protect them. And once that exhaustion sets in, the question quietly shifts. It's no longer, what kind of society do we want? It becomes, what kind of society will make this stop? Here's the next step in the process. When people are exhausted and scared, they don't look for perfect political theory. They look for something that feels solid, and authoritarian movements are very good at offering exactly that, certainty. That's the first trick, simple explanations for complex problems. And you can see it very concretely in how Nazi propaganda marketed itself. One of the most famous examples is the election messaging around work and bread, literally posters and slogans promising jobs and basic security, framed as something Hitler personally will deliver. There are perceived elections posters with exactly the wording, Adolf Hitler will provide work and bread. This is not a detailed economical program, it's psychological offer. You will stop falling. And then comes the second trick, unity as a cure. Nazi propaganda heavily pushed the myth of national community, the idea that all internal divisions would be healed if people stopped arguing and started belonging to one unified we. The message was tailored to people who longed for unity, pride, and end to social fragmentation. Again, this isn't policy, it's emotional architecture. Because in a society that feels torn apart, unity starts to feel more important than freedom, and order starts to feel more important than debate. Third, decisiveness as competence. When parliaments look stuck, the appeal of someone who can finally act becomes stronger. In late Weimar politics, that gridlock was increasingly bypassed through emergency powers. Article 48 allowed the president to rule by reminder, emergency decrees rather than normal parliamentary legislation, and it was used more and more as the crisis deepened. So people watched politics shift from argument to action, and it can feel like competence, even when it's undermining democracy. And this is the part that matters for our question about ordinary people. If you've lived through inflation, then temporary stability, then mass unemployment again, your brain starts to prioritize predictability over ideals. So when an authoritarian movement says, we'll restore order, stop the chaos, bring back the work, and we'll make the nation whole again, that doesn't sound evil. It sounds as solution. And that's how it works. The pitch is not, let's do ours. The pitch is, let's end instability. Fast. Once a movement starts sounding like it has answers, promises of order, unity, competence, the next step is very predictable in historical cases like this. It needs someone to blame, not just competition, not just complexity, someone identifiable. And in Germany, between the wars, that search for culprits was everywhere. Political commentators, right after the war, began to talk about November criminals, politicians blamed for signing the armistice, accused of treason for ending the war that the army hadn't even lost on German soil. This wasn't just insult, it became a widely circulated political narrative that absolved the military and redirected anger at civilian leaders. And once you have narrative like that betrayal caused defeat, it becomes easy to expand the category of enemies. Soon, communists, socialists, Jews, and others were portrayed not as fellow citizens, with different views, but as a cause of instability. This process was heavily reinforced by propaganda, party speeches, publications, and political rallies. The logic was simple. If you can name a problem, you can sell a solution. Linked to that was a powerful promise of restored dignity and identity. After the humiliation of Versailles and years of economic chaos, many Germans feel disoriented. National pride has been battered. The old imperial identity was gone. The new democratic identity felt unstable and unmoored. Authoritarianism movements tapped into that emotional vacuum with messages like, Germany will rise again, you will be respected, you will restore what was lost. This wasn't just abstract rhetoric, it was embedded in every symbols. Flags, uniforms, public spectacles, speeches that stressed belonging, pride, historical greatness. And here's what we come to something more subtle and more dangerous, normalization of extreme views. At first, the language used about certain groups might be careful, legal categories, civil codes, employment restrictions. But over time, and with repetition, the language hardened. It shifted from policy debate to moral condemnations. Once newspapers, political parties, and public figures began regularly describing certain people as threats, the idea stopped sounding exceptional. It began to sound reasonable. That's the essence of normalization, extraordinary claims, repeated over and over, gradually shifting the boundaries of what people considered acceptable. People don't notice the change at the moment it happens. They look back and think, oh, that was obvious. But in real time, the shift is slow, one speech, one slogan, one caricature at a time. And that fits right into the feeling that something is finally happening. Not just chaos anymore, movement, energy, action, and urgency. Action feels like progress, even when it's dismantling safeguards. That feeling that finally something is being done is psychologically powerful, because for people stuck in insecurity, stagnation, fear, and instability, inaction feels worse than risking action. So they embrace narratives that explain who is at fault, promise restoration of dignity, and give the impression of decisive movement. They don't necessarily stop to ask, where does this end? Or, who is being hurt along the way? That's how scapegoating, identity politics, normalization, and the emotional appeal of action works together, not just as propaganda tools, but as psychological magnets in a society seeking relief from prolonged uncertainty. Most people were not ideological fanatics. That's one of the most persistent misunderstandings about how this worked. The majority of the population wasn't marching through the streets, fueled by doctrine or revolutionary convictions. They weren't spending their days studying ideology or actively planning harm. They were trying to live normal lives, to keep their jobs, feed their families, to protect what little stability they still had after years of crisis. And in this context, adaptation often feels less like a choice and more like a necessity. New rules appeared, new expectations, new categories. And for most of the people, the question wasn't, do I agree with this? It was, how do I get through the day without drawing attention? So people adjusted. They learned what not to say, what not to ask, which topics to avoid in public, which opinions were safer to keep private. This is where passive consent becomes more common than active support. Not cheering, not protesting either, just going along. Because resistance is expensive, it costs time, safety, and social standing. And after years of instability, many people were already exhausted. People who have lived through defeat, inflation, unemployment, and political chaos don't have endless energy for moral heroism. They're tired, they want predictability. When the system starts demanding conformity, many people comply, not because they believe deeply, but because they want the crisis to stop. And then there is fear, not always of violence, but especially in the earlier years, it's a fear of standing out, of losing work, being reported, in tightly knit communities being seen as difficult or unreliable could have very real consequences. So silence becomes a survival strategy, and finally responsibility starts to shift. People stop seeing themselves as moral agent and start seeing themselves as part of machine, because this was decided from above me, or I'm just following procedures. And once responsibility is framed that way, moral discomfort doesn't disappear, but it becomes easier to live with. Because if the system is responsible, then individuals don't have to be. And that's the core of this stage. Not fanaticism, not sadism, but normalization through routine, fatigue, fear, and the quiet transfer of responsibility away from the self and onto something abstract called the system. One of the most powerful tools in this whole process isn't violence, it's language. Because language doesn't just describe reality, it organizes it. One of the first shifts you see is change in how people are talked about. Society starts getting divided into we and they. Not always aggressively at first, sometimes it sounds almost administrative. Reliable elements, undesirable elements. Once those categories exist, inequality no longer looks like a moral problem. It looks like classification. And that's how unequal treatment becomes easier to accept. Not all at once, gradually. At first it's framed as exceptions, temporary measures, special cases, then it becomes routine. If certain people are constantly described as problematic, risky, and burdens, the restrictions placed on them start to feel logical. And over time, this produces something dangerous, moral numbing, not hatred, not rage, just dullness. When discrimination is expressed through neutral, technical language, it stops triggering emotional reaction. It becomes background noise. People hear about exclusion and think, that's unfortunate, but it's complicated. But it's not my responsibility. And that's where the phrase, it's not my business, becomes powerful. Because once something is framed as someone else's problem, a different group, a different category, moral responsibility shrinks. It doesn't affect me, I'm not involved, I didn't decide this. And language helps make this feel true. And at the same time, comparison kicks in. In unstable societies, people don't measure justice against ideals. They measure it against others. At least I still have my job. At least my family is safe. At least I'm not one of them. That's how inequality gets normalized. Not because people love it, but because relative security feels like relief. And once that mindset settles in, something subtle happens. Concern for others becomes optional, empathy becomes conditional. Silence starts to feel like neutrality, but it isn't. Because when languages divide, categories, and distances, think nothing isn't neutral. It's participation in the structure that allows harm to continue without resistance. And the most unsettling part is, most people don't experience this as becoming worse. They experience it as become practical. So, this is where the question comes back. The one we started with. If most people weren't ideological fanatics, if many were exhausted, scared, and adapting, how do we actually talk about responsibility? Because there is a difference. There is a difference between people who actively planned, ordered, and carry out harm, and those who lived inside the system without actively resisting it. Active perpetrators made choices that directly produced violence. They exercised power. They initiated harm. But that doesn't mean everyone else was simply innocent. Because responsibility doesn't work like switch. It's not on and off. It exists on a spectrum. Most people operated within a limited space of options. Their freedom was constrained by fear, by law, by social pressure, by material dependence. But constrained choice is not the same as no choice at all. Very few people had complete freedom, but very few had none. That's not uncomfortable middle ground. People faced real moral dilemmas. Survive versus resistance. Keeping your job versus speaking up. Protecting your family versus protecting someone else. And those aren't abstract dilemmas. They're brutal ones. So, judging from a safe distance, it's easy. From hindsight, the lines look clear. We know how it ends. We know what should have been done. But people living inside the moment didn't have the clarity. They made decisions under uncertainty, fatigue, and fear. That doesn't erase responsibility, but it complicates it. Because adaptation can slide into participation, and silence can be used to enable harm. Not because people wanted atrocities, but because they prioritized immediate survival over long-term consequences. So the real moral challenge isn't deciding who was pure and who was evil. It's recognizing that ordinary people can contribute to horrific outcomes without ever feeling like villains. And that's not to condemn entire societies, not to excuse them either, but to understand how easily responsibility can dissolve when systems reward compliance, punish resistance, and make moral disagreements feel like common sense. Because once we understand that, we stop asking comforting questions like, what kind of people would do this? And we start asking the harder one. Under what condition would people like us stop resisting and start adapting instead?